Well, hello internet. This is Steak is Meat. I've been watching a video from Mr. Matty Plays and couldn't help but offer some comments because, Bethesda has, I would have to agree with him, dropped the ball on in terms of Elder Scrolls content. Because he makes a good point that they don't just have to make the mainline games. They could do some clever spin-offs like a strategy game or a variation, or if they could find a distinct way to do like a Total War version game, or and now even I think a great idea for a potential new mainline series is to incorporate some Mountain Blade style gameplay because Mountain Blade um, is, I think, an amazing role-playing game, and they incorporate Total War elements. Um, they incorporate some of the Paradox game elements, along with the sort of more traditional Elder Scrolls Skyrim elements. And now, sure, is it a bit too much of a jack of all trades? I mean, that's generally, I think, the consensus is that it to some extent tries to be too much, and so that ends up hurting some of the better aspects, like the first person elements. And so I think there's enough room for Bethesda to retool the game to have the main element be this first person element, but also allow for, troop commandments and all that stuff. So the emphasis is on the first person and third person type of exploring the world. But to a lesser extent also including, the troop commandments and the army building. Where probably you would have like a army management menu, and then you would be traveling as a group with the army. Maybe for, now I don't think you can do the process, you would be able to process, all those armies, but you probably would scale it down a bit. Quite a bit. Because Mountain Blade, the scale is massive. Even the battles are massive. But yeah, you scale that down to quite a bit, and with increase in computing power of a lot of some later machines, you might be able to do that eventually. Who knows? But definitely not for Elder Scrolls 6. But hopefully, maybe Elder Scrolls 8, if we get that far. I think that might be, I think that's pretty reasonable. With some experimentation in that regards for Elder Scrolls 7, hopefully. If they're not going to do that experimentation for Elder Scrolls 6 and start that process, which I think would make Elder Scrolls 8 that much better in that regard. But yeah, I'm rambling on a bit. But yeah. But talked about how they're just re-releasing Skyrim for more Elder Scrolls content and additional content for Elder Scrolls Online, which I do like. I'm not a huge fan of online. I might be in the future if I start playing it a bit more, but because I will say it has grown on me a bit. I just haven't really found the time to play it because I'm not that big of a fan of it. But I will say it has grown on me. I used to thought it was a bit too difficult, like the MMO style wasn't for me. I'm not that good at the MMO style. But after playing it some more, I have found I've gotten a fair amount better at it than I have been. And it's not just like, you know, it's not so difficult for me to, the mechanics are that foreign to me as much, and I'm able to actually, do pretty well at the game. And that has massively increased my enjoyment of it. Um, so that's definitely a point. But my major problem with Bethesda is they're re-releasing Skyrim. Now, I have no problem with them re-releasing games, but when you're re-releasing the same game that was already just recently released, and you're re-releasing it three times, three official re-releases for the same consoles that's already been released on, within a 10-year period, even though that's the most recent game, despite you having the ability to re-release older titles. Now, obviously, it'd be much easier to re-release, say, Morrowind and Oblivion. And it'd be a bit harder, though not impossible, to reconfigure Daggerfall and Arena into, say, a very accessible and doable area. It might be a little bit more difficult because, those land masses were so expansive, but you could still technically do procedural generation for it. It's not going to be this like grand modern type of like Skyrim build where everything is still to some extent procedurally generated, but you've added in a bunch of stuff by hand. You've tweaked it by hand so that it feels, alive and not, boring, And so, yeah, to me, that is going to be important. That, they re-release their old content. Like, I mean, Pokemon gets this. They re-release Kanto. So, they've re-released Kanto so many times, And, now, while I do get the fatigue that some people have of them re-releasing Kanto, but if I were to think of the alternative, where they would be re-releasing Sword and Shield all the frickin' time, or since they haven't really re-released Sword and Shield, I think the better equivalent would then be re-releasing another Sun and the because a lot of people were fed up that did Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, where it was basically the same game but with some minor improvements and stuff. And not like a sequel like Black and White 2, where it was definitely two different games. Like, the stories were different, and things were different enough to where it was sort of the same game, but not quite. It was like, it wasn't just quality of life improvements. They actually made significant changes to the story in the actual game itself. And so but with Sun and Moon, it was direct practically remakes, but with it was like initial remakes, like right after. So I understand the people being upset with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. Imagine if they did the Sun and Moon Anniversary Edition, Like, that's kind of and then if they did the same thing with, Sword and Shield, that's sort of the frustration we have with Bethesda right now. And to boot, it would be like if the Pokemon Company also never did sequels. Like, I mean, sure, every generation would be a sequel, but there was never the Black and White sequels. We never got, we never even got generation remakes from, and the only way to play Kanto was either in Gen 1 or was either in Gen 1 because they didn't remake Johto for Gen 2. I mean, they didn't remake Kanto, so you could go back to Kanto in the Johto games. I mean, imagine if that happened, where Johto and Kanto were just permanently locked off past Gen 3. You could never play them again. Not even with the Virtual Console, didn't even happen, you know? I mean, they probably would release the Virtual Console with the, like, eventually, because they did do a re-release of Arena in them with the Anthology edition of Skyrim. But imagine if that was it. There was no remakes. There was no official remakes, etc. So that's my main issue with Bethesda right now. Is they've got a a plethora of content that they could potentially remake to the fans that have only played Skyrim. And if you've played Skyrim, there's a decent chance you've played Oblivion, because that game is pretty intelligible with Skyrim. It's definitely different, but it feels very similar to Skyrim. Whereas Morrowind and the others, I mean, Morrowind is somewhat, but it's definitely an acquired taste. And very difficult for Skyrim and Oblivion people. If you've only played Oblivion and Skyrim, and especially if you've played Skyrim first, that it's very difficult to get into Oblivion. I mean, it's very difficult to get into Morrowind, and especially the other titles, because, let's just say, they haven't exactly aged well. I mean, sure, certain mechanics, many role-playing fans would argue are arguably the best role-playing mechanics, but as far as, quality of life and just the generic, modern mechanics that we take for granted, you know, um, like the combat that we take for granted in Oblivion and Morrowind, where as arguably insufficient as it is, many would argue that I think Morrowind, the combat is definitely worse. And also in subsequent games, because at least in Oblivion and Skyrim, you generally have a greater degree of control over your attacks, and that's provided, at least I think some people are more open to that kind of a system, where as opposed to what Morrowind and Arena and Daggerfall have. So, yeah, I think they so. Well, I definitely want the main BGS team to handle the new Elder Scrolls 6 game. I am not opposed to them handing off, like Morrowind or some other game, to a third-party developer like Obsidian or so on, because this would be a remake of arguably a game that really needs it, and it's not as if it's a completely new game where you're trusting the creative direction to go on of a entirely new team to be pretty faithful to the inception of the original series. No, not doing that. All you're doing is saying, hey, can you take this very old game and improve it with modern gameplay mechanics, but be faithful enough to the original game to where you maintain its leveling up and role-play mechanic systems and dialogue tree, but you make it a lot more accessible and digestible for modern audiences. And sure, compromises are going to need to be made, to accommodate all of those things. You cannot make a fully faithful version that's going to satisfy the most ardent Morrowind fans if you also make it more convenient for modern audiences. But I do think you should strive to maintain as much of the original game as possible with just some quality of life upgrades and make it visually a lot more intuitive and such. Overhaul the combat especially. And, but the otherwise general role-playing mechanics should be left intact in the dialogue tree as intact as possible, though I do think it should possibly be more reworded to be more conversational instead of encyclopedic, which I feel like Morrowind was notorious for and could definitely hamper the experience. So be as informational as possible, but less encyclopedic as Morrowind was. That would be definitely a great thing. And the major takeaway is that there is already an effort to remake Morrowind in Skyrim. Now, the major downside to this is it's not going to be an official re-release, meaning you're going to have to potentially mess around with your Skyrim game in order to install and play the Morrowind, which I don't know if you've messed around with mods at all, but these major mods can really mess with your game. Now, if you follow the instructions exactly, you should be fine for a time because updates tend to mess everything up. So I would definitely urge you to be careful on that front and follow and be patient for the update instructions. However, a lot of that headache can be removed if Bethesda takes the opportunity to officially adopt the Skywind team and basically starts, incorporating them, is willing to give them, a full-time job, and if you want to do a part-time status, part-time working on it, you can do that too. And sort of maybe buys out that, and people who don't want to, work on who don't want to be necessarily employed by Bethesda, they could leave and they'll get a paycheck for the equivalent of the work they put in, and then they can do some other stuff. But if they want to, continue, and when Bethesda, say, buys out the work that they've done on Skywind, and all the volunteers involved get a decent paycheck for what they've put into the project in equivalent, I think, and they continue on, I think that could be a great thing. And being a part of the Bethesda network is they'll get access to some official resources and be able to, officially, create like an official menu that will be linked up with the updates and patched in, so that a lot of the headache that fans are going to have to do when installing the mod would be erased if it were officially adopted. And Bethesda can easily monetize this. I think can pretty easily monetize this. And it'll probably sell pretty well because it's more Elder Scrolls content before Elder Scrolls 6. It gets people hyped for Elder Scrolls 6. It gets people reinvested into the lore, gives them more Elder Scrolls content, more arguably official Elder Scrolls content, and so on. Um, because, the Beyond Skyrim projects are taking, understandably, forever. Uh, One, it'll reinvigorate, this, it'll give new meaning to the Skywind project. It'll give, probably breathe a lot more dedication into it, hopefully, and cause it to be released even sooner. And because people can afford to spend more time on it since they're getting paid to. They're officially employed. And so, hopefully that would breathe some major life into the project. It could do the opposite, but I think more than likely it's going to breathe new life into the project. And yeah, it should hopefully. And then, once that's done, they want to continue to do volunteer work. They can go volunteer at Beyond Skyrim or on those projects, to devote more time to the Beyond Skyrim projects. The only major concern I have if they do that is it would possibly, um, is it could possibly, instead make Beyond Skyrim go a little bit slower because people are wanting to get paid and such for their work, as opposed to that. But yeah, I definitely think that it could do some wonders if they were to, officially reach out and buy out some of these projects. Like, hell, if they were to adopt Beyond Skyrim projects also, I mean, leave them with, ideally, they would leave them with the people in charge with creative freedom, but give them, the official tools, recognition, and make them officially paid employee status to make development progress more regular. Because I do think that could be a great, new thing for, that could potentially be pretty neat for the Beyond Skyrim uh, collective. But I definitely think, but I don't think that's entirely likely that Bethesda is going to do that for Beyond Skyrim. I think it's more likely that they'll do it for Skywind, maybe, and potentially Sky Oblivion, but only if they get the sense of pressure to say, do so, and that it's going to be a money-making operation for them, and that this is what the fans want. So long as they feel some pressure for that kind of thing, and they crunch the numbers and decide it's financially beneficial to buy it out and then pay these, amateur developers to continue on, but instead of doing volunteer work, they're actively being paid to do the same work, but more consistently and regularly to put it out. And I think that's. I don't think that's super likely, but I definitely think that's to some extent possible, and it depends on if we're willing to put the pressure on Bethesda to re-release Morrowind and potentially even Oblivion. Because if they do that, either they're going to have to hire a new team to develop it from scratch, or they're just going to buy out a Skywind and Sky Oblivion. And whichever makes more financial sense is the one that's going to win the day. So, yeah. And I think given that Skywind has already made some significant progress, I think instead of starting from scratch, they'll at least try and come to an arrangement with the Skywind team. And so I definitely think they might try to come to some sort of agreement. Um, so everyone's going to be compensated for their contributions. You know, that I'm not going to say that's going to be easy to do. To quantify and measure what percentage of the project each person, each volunteer has individually put into it. That's going to be a monumentally complicated task that's going to involve mathematical algorithms, or potentially, if everyone's fine with it, they're just going to get, if you did at least some minor work on the project, you're going to get a, a very nominal fee, and then the major contributors are going to get are definitely going to get a fair amount more. But yeah, I think they might at least consider that and have talks with the Skywind team and about what was done, and going over logs about what current and former volunteers have contributed, and quantifying that into some percentage, so that if you contributed to the project, you got something, since it was bought out and officially adopted as a Bethesda Studios project. So yeah, this has been a fairly long rant and ramble, but yeah. And let me just see what else was in my comment. Yeah, I think I pretty much addressed everything. So, bye for now, and I'll see you sometime soon. Hopefully. I'm pretty inconsistent about uploading, so hopefully I'll see you pretty soon.